So I've been contemplating a lot about the psychological factors in social media and, the impending 5G rollout. I came across some experiments that have been conducted in the past that you might not know about, and I wanted to share them with you. Here's one. It's called Banduru's Bobo Doll Experiment. Does watching violence on television cause children behave more aggressively? In a series of experiments conducted during the early 1960s, psychologist Albert Bandura set out to investigate the impact of observing aggression on children's behavior. In his Bobo doll experiments, children would watch a video of an adult interacting with a Bobo doll. In one condition, the adult model behaved passively towards the doll, but in another condition, the adult would kick, punch, strike, and yell at the doll. The results revealed that the children who watched the adult model behave violently towards the doll were more likely to imitate the aggressive behavior later on. Why is the Bobo doll experiment so famous today? The debate over the degree to which the violence on television influences children's behavior continues to rage on today, so it perhaps comes as no surprise that Bandura's findings are still so relevant. The experiment has also helped inspire hundreds of additional studies exploring the impact of observed aggression and violence. So, as this was shown in the 1960s, that this experiment ultimately leads into children mimicking violence. So when people try to argue that what they see on TV doesn't interact with real life, it's not true. And as this study also suggested, or rather tells us, they still are doing experiments, inspired hundreds of additional studies exploring the impacts of observed aggression and violence. Now, I can tell you from my teenage years that watching Beavis and Butthead, as much as I found them funny, I saw my peers, especially males, acting as if they were Beavis and Butthead. They would talk like them, they would be strange like them. Ren and Stimpy, same thing. We tend to do the art imitates life, life imitate art in a big circle. More in recent years, I see a lot of kids do the Family Guy impressions. When I was a child, we used to imitate The Simpsons and, get in a bit of trouble for, using curse words, which weren't usually... Well, they were never really on cartoons up until that point. And when we first heard it, we were like, oh, wow, cartoons are allowed to curse? I guess that means it's okay for me to curse. Because prior to that, we had Care Bears and, more child-oriented cartoons like Thundercats and such. And obviously they had their flaws and there was suggestive material inside of those, but it wasn't as blatant as something like The Simpsons. But let's move on. The Stanford Prison Experiment. This one's interesting. During the early 70s, Philip Zimbardo set up a fake prison in a basement of Stanford's psychology department, recruited participants to play prisoners and guards, and play the role of the prison warden. The experiment was designed to look at the effect that a prison environment would have on behavior, but quickly became one of the most famous and controversial experiments of all time. The Stanford Prison Experiment was originally slated to last a full 2 weeks. It ended after just 6 days. Why? Because the participants became so enmeshed in their assumed roles that the guards became almost sadistically abusive, the prisoners became anxious, depressed, and emotionally disturbed. While the experiment was designed to look at prison behavior, it has since become an emblem of how powerful people are influenced by situations. Why is the Stanford experiment so famous today? Part of the notoriety stemmed from the study's treatment of the participants. The subjects were placed in a situation created considerable psychological distress, so much so that the study had to be halted less than halfway through the experiment. The study has long been upheld as an example of how people yield to situation, but critics have suggested that participants' behavior may have been unduly influenced by Zimbardo himself in his capacity as mock prison's warden. So what he did essentially was make prisoners and guards, and he himself played the role of the warden. Now, this experiment shows that people can be easily influenced by having a higher authority figure telling them to do something that they normally wouldn't do. And then you have the prisoners, the captive ones, even though this was just an experiment, and I'm assuming it doesn't really say, let me see, it seems like they all volunteered to do this, but the psychological damage that it caused in just 6 days was enough to just halt the experiment, because really people took to this as if like, oh, you have this position of power, so if the warden tells you to abuse the power, you go along, instead of being one of the few who don't. This one I looked into a lot. It's called the Milgram experiments. Let's read about it. Following the trial of Adolf Eichmann for war crimes committed during the World War II, psychologist, I don't know why I keep saying that today, Stanley Milgram wanted to better understand why people obey. Could it be that Eichmann and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we all call them accomplices? Milgram wondered. The results of his controversial obedience experiments were nothing short of astonishing and continue to be both thought-provoking and controversial today. The study involved ordering participants to deliver increasingly painful shocks to another person. While the victim was simply a Confederate, not just a Confederate, but like a participant, knowingly an actor. There you go. Pretending to be injured, the participant fully believed that they were given electrical shocks to the other person. Even when the victim was protesting or complaining of heart conditions, 65% of the participants continued to deliver painful, possibly fatal shocks on the experimenter's orders. Why Milgram's research so notoriously today? Obviously, no one wants to believe that they are capable of inflicting pain or torture on another human being simply on the orders of an authority figure. This result of the obedience experiments are disturbing because they reveal that people are much more obedient than they like to believe. The study is also controversial because it suffers from numerous ethical concerns, primarily the psychological distress it created for participants. And here's our social media thing. Now, that experiment, people, what I read about it was most people actually, even though they said, can we stop? And the warden would use, not the warden, I guess the experimenter would say, the experiment requires that you must continue. You have to do this. So using those phrases, even though the person that was, sending the shocks to the actor who was pretending to be shocked, they still went ahead and did it because they felt like, for some reason, that the experimenter, because it was at Yale, knew what they were doing, knew how far they could go, and they even had one actor pretend that he died during the experiment, and that caused a lot of psychological harm. Now, what's highly controversial about this is that they said they debriefed them all afterwards and let them know that the experiment wasn't real, but apparently that isn't so. These people didn't even find out about that, and they were only offered $4.50 to do this through a newspaper ad. But I guess at that time, that's some money. So they didn't even know that when they walked out of that room, that what they just did was fake. And that's the really screwed up part, because, you know, it's one thing to do an experiment. It's another thing to not let the people that participated know that they didn't really do this. Now, why is this important? Because in the sense of like war crimes or anything like that, it shows how many people would be obedient towards a master in a situation, or a drill sergeant, or, you know, the likes. So, like, when you think of things like what if martial law came to be, or any type of major event happened, you're going to have, and because the experiment shows that more people are willing to side and go along with an authority figure, more people, they're going to be able to just let go of their principles and go along with the sergeant's orders or the government's orders because they say so. And then you have people who go against the grain, somebody like me, that if you told me to shock somebody, and I don't care, you could say, the experiment tells you have to do this. I would say, no, I don't, who tells me this? What is my ramifications if I don't? Will you kill me? Or did you really offer me $4.50 to have me killed? That's my rational thinking. I think that more people need to be people like that. Go against the grain. Question everything. And not just be a soldier. So, again, we go back to the social media problems. And this is your brain on... this is your brain on social media. Any questions? I mean, really. So, they did a study, and they found out that the average 13 to 17-year-old devotes around an hour and 40 minutes a day on social media websites such as Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter. In a startling testament to the rise of selfie culture, many also spend up to 15 minutes a day taking pictures of themselves to send to their friends or post online. According to a recent UCLA study, the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, lights up when people receive likes on social media. As in other areas of life, people strive for this acceptance, and this addiction to social media is now more prevalent than the addiction to cigarettes and alcohol. As the article people wrote in their previous blog, Status of Mind, Instagram and Snapchat have been named the 2 worst social media platforms for those with mental health disorders. Body image, sleep patterns, and a sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, are all impacted when we log into our profiles. People are using social media to show their perfect life. We all see the Snapchat stories of people laughing and having a great time. We all see the Instagram posts of beautiful people in beautiful places, and they appear happy and not to have a care in the world. However, these images often do not show reality. Lastly, remember that social media is not real. People are only showing you what they want you to see. The images have been edited. The information has been altered. If we all were who we are on social media, there would be no authenticity and no one would truly know anyone. So this is reminiscent of the older days when you had magazines and such, or just when you would look at movie stars. So now everyday people, and this is where it really does psychologically screw with you, because back in the day when you would see a magazine and you would see some beautiful woman on the cover and you were not her, or you didn't look like her, you didn't have her body, I'm speaking to females specifically, you would be upset with yourself, and if you had low self-esteem already, those images just further made you not like yourself. So you would have more depression, eating disorders, anxiety. You'd feel like you didn't fit in, especially if your peers were different than you, or, what you would consider more the type that would be on that magazine. Then you have the movie stars on the television who all seem to have the same uniform shapes and faces. And even if they weren't that attractive, there was something about them that you felt like you didn't have. Or maybe that you did have it, but you had no way of knowing how to get to that level to say, nobody's ever going to notice me. You know, the only people who know me are like my 5 friends I'm around. But now, with social media, you can gain attention that you weren't able to gain before, which puts you in that odd, I guess it would be a stasis between being somebody on TV and being just a regular person. So you know that images are altered and they have all these filters and stuff like that, and people tend to want to catch the best of whatever situation they're in, or the worst. It's like everybody became a photographer overnight, and everybody became a model overnight. So then they started the body positive thing because a chubbier person would get, boo, you know, you're not attractive, da 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 da, and you put yourself out there much like the actors and singers do, and you get to feel what they feel just on a smaller, more personal level. You know, on Facebook, like I have like close to what would be 5,000 friends. How many of those people do you think I know in real life? Probably about 50. So a lot of those people came to my social media platform through that. They had the same interests as me. They knew the companies that I worked around, or they came from my pictures. The minute I said I'm taking down my pictures because they weren't exactly reading my content, they started reading my content. So it shows you how vapid and how small the attention span is of the average person. I'm also clipping in a video from YouTube, so I'd like you to watch that. But thank you for listening. I hope that you share this and subscribe, and that you maybe learn something that you didn't know, or maybe you can share this with a kid or a teenager or somebody who's struggling with self-esteem, to see that the correlation of the magazine from the days when you were growing up is much like today's society of social media, where everybody looks like they're a model, but because we have all this editing software and such like that, that these people aren't what they look like either, and they might be having a good time in the video, but I promise you that that's only a small snippet of a very long day or a very boring day. So, yep, that's it, and thank you for watching.
Here are 5 crazy ways that social media and the internet are affecting your brain right now. Can't log off? Surprisingly, 5 to 10% of internet users are actually unable to control how much time they spend online. Though it's a psychological addiction as opposed to a substance addiction, brain scans of these people actually show a similar impairment of regions that those with drug dependence have. Specifically, there's a clear degradation of white matter in the regions that control emotional processing, attention, and decision-making. Because social media provides immediate rewards with very little effort required, your brain begins to rewire itself, making you desire these stimulations, and you begin to crave more of this neurological excitement after each interaction. Sounds a little like a drug, right? We also see a shift when looking at multitasking. You might think that those who use social media or constantly switch between work and websites are better at multitasking, but studies have found that when comparing heavy media users to others, they perform much worse during task switching tests. Increased multitasking online reduces your brain's ability to filter out interferences and can even make it harder for your brain to commit information to memory. Like when your phone buzzes in the middle of productive work. Or wait, did it even buzz? Phantom vibration syndrome is a relatively new psychological phenomenon where you think you felt your phone go off, but it didn't. In one study, 89% of test subjects said they experienced this at least once every 2 weeks. It would seem that our brains now perceive an itch as an actual vibration from our phone. As crazy as it seems, technology has begun to rewire our nervous system, and our brains are being triggered in a way they never have before in history. Social media also triggers a release of dopamine, the feel-good chemical. Using MRI scans, scientists found that the reward centers in people's brains are much more active when they're talking about their own views as opposed to listening to others. Not so surprising, we all love talking about ourselves, right? But it turns out that while 30 to 40% of face-to-face conversations involve communicating our own experiences, around 80% of social media communication is self-involved. The same part of your brain related to orgasms, motivation, and love are stimulated by your social media use, and even more so when you know you have an audience. Our body is physiologically rewarding us for talking about ourselves online. But it's not all so self-involved. In fact, studies on relationships have found that partners tend to like each other more if they meet for the first time online rather than with a face-to-face interaction. Whether it's because people are more anonymous or perhaps more clear about their future goals, there's a statistical increase in successful partnerships that started online. So while the internet has changed our verbal communication with increased physical separation, perhaps the ones that matter the most end up even closer.